Last time we spoke, the Qing Dynasty was looking rather dreadful. More and more people were flocking to the Taiping, as the European forces were humiliating the Qing government. Yet the more independent figure of Zheng Guofan and his Liang Army were making headway with its siege of Anqing, so much so that it forced the Shield King to depart from Nanjing to meet the enemy on the field. The foreign community had completely lost its faith in the Taiping and sent envoys to see what relations could still be made. Then the grand pincer attack of the Taiping kings failed horribly, and they were unable to stop the Liang army from capturing Anqing. Nanjing was now threatened yet again, and it seemed no headway was being made with the foreigners to earn their support. Can the Taiping come back from such defeats? This episode is the Taiping Rebellion Part 5, Li Hongzhang and the Anhui Army. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals is an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over on YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just now finishing up a multi-part series on China's warlord era. And just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account and can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there are many goodies like early access, Discord benefits, your names in the credits and such, the general stuff. But I'm also making exclusive content, and that includes podcasts. So if there's some subjects you really want to hear about but I can't cover here, or on the other projects I'm part of, well, just let me know and check out my Patreon. On August the 22nd of 1861, Emperor Sam Fong died at the age of 30. The probable cause of his death was tuberculosis, but many romanticize him as dying of shame and disgrace, and never returning to Beijing. I think, personally, his rapid abuse of opium may have contributed also. Zheng Guofan received the news on September the 14th, and he had this to write. Heaven has collapsed. The earth is split open. My emperor, from the time he came to the throne until today, over the course of 12 years, never knew a day when he wasn't consumed by worry over our dangers. Now Anqing is finally conquered, and the long hairs have begun to weaken. It looks as if the war has reached a turning point. But my emperor did not live long enough to hear the report of victory, so his dejection and melancholy will follow him into eternity. What a terrible agony that is for me and for all of his ministers. Sam Fong had died just after 11 years of rule, and to make matters worse, the throne was supposed to go from father to son, but Sam Fong was notably infertile. In spite of spending literally almost all of his time with his harem of 18 concubines and wives for years, Sam Fong had managed to only father a single son. This son, in 1861, was just 5 years of age. Hong Rengan began to preach and boast about the situation. Emperor Sam Fong just left a little demon who is several years old and will find it quite difficult to continue his demon rule. This is precisely the time for us to seize the opportunity to uphold heaven and to render ourselves not unworthy in our role as heroes of the world. Confidence in the dynasty was crumbling. Many of the elites within Beijing began to compare the previous Qing emperor's reigns to the current situation. Yet, while many of these elites lamented about how the dynasty was in decay, none offered any remedy to the situation, much like politicians of today. As much as Beijing was in disarray, the Taiping were in no position to march upon it. After all, they had just lost Anqing. However, the death of Sam Fong reinvigorated the Taiping nonetheless. Chen Yucheng and the remnants of his battered army were cut off in northern Anhui, while Li Xiaocheng was marching east into Zhejiang province. Zhejiang at this time held around 26 million people, and Li Xiaocheng planned to conquer the province and gain further independence from Hongrengan. Hongrengan did not want Zhejiang province, well, at least not at this time. What he wanted was for the Taiping to consolidate and take back Anqing. Control over the Yangtze region was the key to his strategy of consolidating a southern empire, and for that Anqing was a major component. He began to beg Li Xiaocheng, sending letters from Nanjing to turn his army back around to smash Zhangguofan. The Yangtze has been described as a serpent, with its head at Hubei, its body in Anhui, and its tail in Jiangnan. We don't have Hubei, and if we let go of Anhui as well, the serpent will be sundered, and the tail won't survive for long on its own. To all of this, Li Xiaocheng simply replied that Anqing was a hopeless cause, and that he would not leave Zhejiang province. Hongrengan was livid, but what could he really do? Now, the way Hongrengan described the Yangtze as a serpent was something Zhangguofan also ascribed to. Both men understood the enormous advantage Wuchang and Anqing presented. They both controlled vast regions of agriculture. But along the eastern coast, particularly the port cities, well, they held enormous amounts of wealth, and this is what attracted Li Xiaocheng to Zhejiang province. As a result of him taking his forces into Zhejiang, now the overall momentum of the Taiping strategy skewed to the east. Hongrengan also had changed after his military disaster at Dongcheng. He was more bitter, angry that the foreigners would not support their cause, and the second he had left Nanjing, the Hong brothers had done everything they could to belittle him. One major thing they did was take away the need for Hongrengan's seal to forward information to the Heavenly King, thus taking the mediator monopoly away from him. This also came at a time when Hong Xiuquan's son was older and sitting in on important meetings, learning the ropes, as they say. The Heavenly Son was gradually becoming more important than Hongrengan. He was no longer the undisputed second-in-command of the movement. Despite this, Hongrengan still remained in charge of foreign relations and much of the administration of Nanjing. While Hongrengan was out of Nanjing, a ton of setbacks had occurred, however. The worst were the demands imposed upon the Taiping by Admiral Hope and Harry Parkes, that the Taiping should stay at least 30 miles away from Shanghai and other treaty ports such as Hankow and Wuchang. The 5-year-old heir to the Qing Dynasty was the son of one of Sam Fong's concubines, a pretty Manchu woman named Yehonala. She gave birth to the boy at the age of 20, and since he was the sole male, this made her status rise as she was, technically, the mother of a soon-reigning emperor, a rank that compared to that of being the wife of the emperor. Her title became known as Empress Dowager, and she is quite infamous in modern Chinese history. Her name, since becoming the Empress Dowager, became Cixi. She is often compared to Queen Victoria, as both would become the most powerful woman of the 19th century. When Sam Fong died, he issued an edict naming 8 closest Manchu advisors as regents for his son. Traditionally, when a new emperor was too young to rule, power was entrusted to the regents or family members until the emperor was old enough. With the boy being of 5 years of age, the regents could expect to rule over the empire for at least a decade. Pretty good gig. Many of these regents hated the Europeans and dreamed of breaking the unequal treaties. Yet Prince Gong, who many thought was too soft on the foreigners, sought a plan to appease the foreigners by creating an Office of Foreign Affairs, so that in the meantime all the strength of the Qing Empire could be brought down upon the Taiping. Now the only check to the powers of the new regents was the pair of Empress Dowagers, Cixi and Sam Fong's widow. Before his death, he had given them each an imperial seal. While all the edicts would be composed by the regents, it would be the Dowager Empresses who would hold veto powers using said seals. Sam Fong's widow proved compliant to the regents from the very offset, but Cixi did not follow the regents without question. She quickly began to assert her independence and threatened to withhold approval for some of the regents' policy decisions, creating a tension between the 8 male regents and the mother of the emperor. The tensions came to a head in late October when Sam Fong's remains were finally brought back to Beijing, and in the grand funeral procession, 124 barriers carried the dead emperor, and at their head was Cixi, the top-ranking regent. The 2 Dowager Empresses traveled with a forward party escorting the young emperor in a closed palanquin. The Empresses would have a single day in the capital before Cixi would get there, and they quickly went to work. The Empresses rushed over to meet with Prince Gong immediately, using their private guards to thwart some of the other regents who were trying to prevent them from making an audience. Some of the regents even tried to stop the boy emperor from meeting Prince Gong, but Prince Gong had become quite popular in Beijing, having been the only one who stayed to do anything, really. He really was the only guy who helped the city when the foreigners attacked. Thus, the population, and more importantly, the Beijing guards, stopped the regent's forces for him. It also turns out Cixi had spent weeks secretly meeting with Prince Gong's brother at the hunting retreat in Rehe, and they formed a plan. Prince Gong accompanied the empresses into Beijing, making sure the regents were nowhere near them. Then Prince Gong read out an edict in the emperor's name using the Empress Dowager seals, charging Cixi and the other regents of treason. Who could have seen that one coming? A detachment of Manchu guards, led by Prince Gong's brother, rode out to confront Cixi, arresting him and the other regents. They were accused of causing a war with Britain and France by misleading the late Emperor Sam Fong with treacherous advice. They were blamed for the kidnapping of Harry Parkes and the other envoys, breaking faith with the foreign community and provoking Lord Elgin to march upon the capital. They also prevented the emperor against his will from returning to Beijing and faked the emperor's will to make them regents. This is some real Game of Thrones shit right here. The trials were quick, as you would imagine, and within a week the regents were found guilty of all charges. 5 of them were stripped of their rank and banished to the western frontiers. The 3 most powerful regents, Cixi, Duanhua, and Saiyuan, were sentenced to death. But in a display of compassion, Cersei Lannister, Empress Dowager Cixi, no idea how I mixed those 2 figures up. I see what you did, Mr. George R. Martin. While Cixi granted Zuahuan and Duohuai the privilege of strangling themselves with silk. But it turned out to be a symbolic gesture, as they were quickly hung in a dungeon. For Cixi, who proved to be her true rival, he was beheaded in public on November the 8th in a cabbage market. Yeah, not too exciting, that one. Now, edicts proclaimed Empress Dowager Cixi would, quote, should in person administer the government and be assisted by a counselor or counselors, to be chosen from among the princes of the highest order, and immediately allied to the throne. And thus Empress Dowager Cixi, with Prince Gong as her chief advisor, became the new rulers of the Qing Dynasty. Now, coming back to a point I made, quite a while back, honestly. I think during the first episode of the series, mind you. Karl Marx predicted in 1853 that the Taiping Rebellion would cripple British trade in China. And he was quite wrong, at least initially. Ironically, the Civil War had severed the internal trade networks within China, causing merchants to dramatically look to external trade, thus booming British trade. Figures rose about 30% from 1860 to 1861, but then another large event unfolded. Another civil war, this time in America. Britain was thus trapped between two large civil wars. British commerce relied heavily upon both of these nations at the time. The United States, aka King Cotton in the South, provided the cotton for British textiles, which they sold in the Far East. 3/4 of British cotton came from the U.S. South, and because of the tricky political situation, now Britain could not afford to deal with those Southerners lest they get caught up in the Civil War. Now, until the cotton dried up from the U.S., Britain was able to undersell the Chinese domestic cotton market. But with the outbreak of the war, the prices soon rose too high, and now the Chinese were simply not buying their stuff. British exports dropped dramatically, causing textile factories to shut down. Cotton was just one part of the conundrum, however, because alongside it, the Americans consumed around 2/3 of the green tea purchased by British merchants from China. Thus, the British tea and textile trade was being torn to bits. There was one gleaming light of hope, however. The new treaty ports in China offered some new opportunities. The British could trade between the ports, especially those along the Yangtze River. Hell, the internal trade networks were shattered as a result of the Civil War, but the British enjoyed steam power along the rivers and the ability to go freely from port to port. Now Britain sought profit. To do so, they needed to expand the Chinese markets. And this meant doing some business with the Taiping, who held some of the good ports. Until now, Britain had avoided open relations with the Taiping, you see. Now, on May the 13th of 1861, Britain announced recognition of the Confederacy, meaning Britain would treat the South as a separate government, contending for power, and not a, quote, lawless rebellion. To the merchants in China, this seemed to be the ideal situation that they should be adopting there. Many called for treating the Taiping the same as the Confederacy. Hell, the Confederacy was recognized after mere months, while the Taiping had been around for 10 years at this point. The House of Commons debated the matter, and after a very long and tedious back and forth, it was decided the neutrality stance must be sustained. Given, however, that the Taiping did not hinder British trade within the provinces that they controlled, however. Meanwhile, Li Hongzhang's army was running rampant in Zhejiang province, taking the capital of Hangzhou in December of 1861 after 8 weeks of siege. The city held 2.3 million inhabitants, and it proved quite easy to starve them out. Li Hongzhang had his men fire arrows with messages into the city stating the people would not be harmed and would be given the choice to join the Taiping or be left to leave freely. As one Qing commander at Hangzhou put it, "Because the loyal king issued orders not to harm the people didn't help fight against him. Thus, none of the people suffered at the hands of the longhairs. And they all turned around and blamed the Imperials for their afflictions. Thus, the Manchu garrison burnt themselves alive, while Qing officials slit their own throats. But the common people went unmolested. A nice change for once." It also seems Li Hongzhang took notice of the horrifying atrocities performed by Zheng Guofan at Anqing and wanted to earn the high ground with the commoners by pointing out how terrible the Manchu were. He even let the Manchu and Qing officials in Hangzhou go free, though there wasn't many to do so as they all killed themselves. Hangzhou was the capital and linchpin of Zhejiang province, an enormous blow to the Qing Dynasty. But there was another city that was almost as significant, Ningbo, a treaty port, on the other side of Hangzhou Bay, and just due south of Shanghai. To go from Ningbo to Hangzhou by land was around 200 miles, roughly double the distance of that by ship. The Qing forces at Shanghai hoped Ningbo's close proximity would mean the foreigners might defend the city as well. But Bruce stamped that down pretty quickly, sending word to the consul at Ningbo that if the Taiping were to attack, the British would not get involved. He also told Admiral Hope, "I do not think we can take upon ourselves the protection of Ningbo. We should not display British naval power near that city, lest we get compromised in this civil contest." Admiral Hope seems to have seen things a bit differently, as upon hearing in May of 1861 that the Taiping were going to march on Ningbo, he dispatched Captain Roderick Dhu in the 14-gun ship called Encounter to dissuade the rebels. Captain Dhu was also told to try and make contact with any Taiping commanders nearest to Shanghai, and to relay the same type of messages Harry Parkes had when it came to Hankow. "Point out to the commander that the capture and destruction of the town of Ningbo would be extremely injurious to British trade, and that he should desist from all hostile proceedings against the town. Don't commit yourself to the necessity of having recourse to force, but do remind him of what took place last year at Shanghai." After giving the veiled threat to the Taiping, Captain Dhu went to Ningbo and told the Qing officials to mount every possible defense that they could. Dhu was told by Admiral Hope that under no circumstances could he open fire upon the Taiping. It really was just a bluff in the end. But Hope also asked Dhu to investigate Ningbo and figure out, quote, "the amount of auxiliary European force which you think is sufficient for its defense." It seems to me there was some realpolitik at play here. Both Admiral Hope and Frederick Bruce were planning ahead for what they assumed would be a major policy change. Both men expected their government to change its mind and wanted to be ready at a whim's notice to defend any British interests from the Taiping. But in essence, as you can see, their actions were also drawing in conflict with the Taiping. It's the old self-fulfilling prophecy. Both men did not want to see the Qing overthrown by the Taiping, because they seemed the better choice as far as trade was concerned. All the custom duties from the treaty ports were being used by the Qing to pay reparations to the British for the Second Opium War. And that is really the crux of it all, getting those payments. If the Taiping took a port, well, the British could expect no return. But to prop up the Qing meant an endless cash flow. Nonetheless, the Taiping represented a large threat. The British simply did not have enough forces to defend all their interests for the meantime. They had to play a sort of ballet between the Taiping and Qing for now. Captain Dhu ended up bringing 12 large cannons from the British Armory at Shanghai and installed them on Ningbo's walls, figuring it was not British manning them, so it didn't really breach neutrality. But lo and behold, the Qing officials did not lift a single finger to help defend the city. And why would they? If they made the situation worse, perhaps the British would become more and more involved. When the Taiping approached Ningbo, the city emptied. Well, all those who could flee did. On November the 26th, the Taiping were 30 miles off from Ningbo, and by December the 2nd, just a day's march, when the British sent a party to parley with them. The British pleaded for the Taiping to give the city one more week before assaulting it, and they agreed to this for some unknown reason. On December the 9th, 60,000 Taiping advanced in 2 columns towards the city gates as the Taiping naval units rowed over to scale the walls from the sea. It was a relatively peaceful conquest, as just about all the Qing officials had fled prior. Of course, the usual looting was done, but very little murders were performed. The French, American, and British officials came to Ningbo to talk to the Taiping, demanding that they respect their trade privileges, and the Taiping commanders agreed enthusiastically, offering to execute anyone who would dare lift a finger on any foreigner. Thus, for the Taiping, this was an incredible victory, and it was one step closer to establishing good relations with the foreigners. 1862 was a year of many unknowns for China. Both Beijing and Nanjing were reforming themselves, and no one could accurately predict how the war was going to go. Zhang Guofan was building up his Liang Army, now using Anqing as an HQ. His power base was now in Anhui province. To the east, Li Hongzhang controlled Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces. Nearly a quarter of China's yearly income came from these combined territories. After grabbing Ningbo, the only logical step forward was, well, Shanghai. It was a gleaming gem. Unbelievable revenues could be earned by its control. The past 2 years had shown Li Hongzhang that the British simply would not pay the Taiping proper recognition nor respect, and so he sought to finally do something about it. Li Hongzhang began to prepare his army to return to Shanghai, this time not so lightly armed. Li Hongzhang was never one to believe the foreigners could have ever been won over in the first place, and now Hong Rengan's authority was widely diminished in Nanjing. As for out here in the east, it was honestly Li Hongzhang's show, and he was going to do what he wanted. As for the British, Ningbo seemed to not be trading much at all since the Taiping came. Anqing had fallen to Zhang Guofan, and all the meanwhile Bruce was sending reports back home of endless Taiping atrocity stories, whenever they took a city. Most of these stories were fabricated. Bruce was trying to make Parliament see that the stance of neutrality would eventually lead to the death of British trade. Harry Parkes also traveled back to Britain, who would have a lot to say to the public about his time in China. His mistreatment, after all, was the rationale for the burning of the Summer Palace. The very last deed he performed before sailing off was a last-ditch effort to stop the Taiping from approaching Shanghai, which they refused. In fact, the negotiations had gone so terribly, one of Admiral Hope's commanders threatened to attack the rebels if they dared come near Shanghai. Now back to Zhang Guofan, he finally had Anqing, but now he faced the daunting need for more and more men. By taking Anqing, he now gained the vast territory around it, holding tens of millions of people spreading towards the east. The Taiping still controlled many towns in northern Anhui, and Chen Yucheng was in full retreat going downstream towards Nanjing. Everything east of Nanjing was pretty much a hopeless cause. Zhang Guofan's men were exhausted. They had spent basically a year besieging Anqing. Many wanted to go back home. Morale was quite low. Zhang Guofan began to rebuild in Anqing using his own men as laborers. Under his direction, they rebuilt the Confucian Academy and Examination Hall, repaired the walls, and restored the markets. Next, he set up relief stations to help the famine-stricken population and help them restore the agricultural output of the region. He also sent his brother, Guochuan, back to their homelands of Hunan to recruit another 6,000 Hunanese soldiers, because the next push was going to be against Nanjing. Now, Zhang Guofan was taking a bit of a risk sending his brother to do such a thing. There was a coup going on in Beijing, the Cixi Cersei Lannister one I spoke of. He did not really know what the outcome was going to be from said coup, and his actions could be judged as anti-Qing, since he was gaining more and more power independently from Beijing. Zhang Guofan already had a growing number of critics within Beijing who saw him as a growing threat to the central government. Thus, he simply dispatched word back to the capital stating he needed to gather as many forces as he could to be able to march upon Nanjing to rid the dynasty of the Taiping menace. But this was all a facade. In order to actually defeat Nanjing, it had to be strangled from supplies, similar to what had occurred at Anqing. Yet Chen Yucheng loomed around in northern Anhui, and he was still yet to consolidate all of southern Anhui. He would need to take the vast territory in southern Anhui towards Hangzhou in Zhejiang province, and this would require colossal forces. But a strategy formed in his mind. he envisioned 3 separate armies attacking in unison, one from Anqing going east downriver to Nanjing. Another, led by Zhou Zongtang, would march through Jiangxi into Zhejiang province to smash Hangzhou. The last would march through Jiangsu and fight towards Suzhou and then Nanjing. But such feats required vast amounts of men, and he was beginning to think his homelands of Hunan were being drained of all their youthful men. Thus, he cast aside his conservative methods for the first time, and he began to cast a wider net. He was going to trust a non-Hunanese man to help him in his endeavors. One of my personal favorite figures in modern Chinese history, Li Hongzhang. Li Hongzhang was 38 years old at the time, a scholar from Anhui province, and he was asked to help form a new provincial militia that could supplement Zheng Guofan's Hunanese one. Just like Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang was a Hanlin scholar, an elite who scored top of the examination system. He was 11 years younger to Zheng Guofan. His father literally passed the Cixi examination in Beijing in the same group as Zheng Guofan in 1838. The two men became close early on. When Li Hongzhang arrived in Beijing in 1844, fresh from his passing of the provincial examination, it was Zheng Guofan who agreed to serve as his teacher, to help prepare him for the Jinxi, which he passed with distinction in 1847. They were tied by friendship through Li Hongzhang's father, making Zheng Guofan something like an uncle to him. But even more than that, Zheng Guofan was his teacher and mentor. And within the Confucian culture, a student and teacher were more akin to a son and father. Yet despite such close ties, it took Zheng Guofan a long time to come to a point where he would actually trust Li Hongzhang with his own army. Zheng Guofan knew the man was brilliant. He also knew he was very ambitious. Li Hongzhang's older brother served on Zheng Guofan's staff. But when Li Hongzhang came to Zheng Guofan's military HQ in Hunan in 1858 looking for employment, he was turned away. He was not just turned away, he was literally ignored for over a month. Yes, Li Hongzhang spent a month hanging around until he got so frustrated he demanded Zheng Guofan give him an answer, which Zheng Guofan did, through an aide, with some sarcasm added to it. He said this to Li Hongzhang. Perhaps the Hunan army was a bit too shallow a beach in which to harbor such a large ship as Li Hongzhang. What Zheng Guofan was doing, and would continue to do so for many years, was to break Li Hongzhang's arrogance. Li Hongzhang was known by many to be quite ambitious and very, very arrogant in his youth. Zheng Guofan did this by various means, such as having guards drag Li Hongzhang literally out of bed whenever he had overslept. Zheng Guofan was trying to toughen the man up, to test his grit. Li Hongzhang, for his part, hung in there, trying to convince Zheng Guofan of his loyalty and humility. They got into fights, of course, and this did lead to Li Hongzhang leaving for a while, but by 1862, their relationship was solid, and Zheng Guofan, either through his trust in the man or desperation, entrusted him with basically being his second in command. Now, there was some negatives to all this, of course. Zheng Guofan had very experienced military commanders at this point, much more experienced than someone like Li Hongzhang. But Zheng Guofan was a scholar more than anything else in the world, and he valued Li Hongzhang's Hanlin scholarship above all else. In early 1862, Li Hongzhang began to form a regional militia using the exact same model as the Xiang Army, which would become known as the Anhui Army, or the Hui Army later on. He performed the same type of recruitment scheme, going first to his home district, forming companies of troops from the same homes to serve officers who they had connections to. Several thousand Anhui commoners were brought to Anqing by February to begin training under the guidance of veteran officers of the Xiang Army. This new army would have the exact same structure, same training, and for all intents and purposes was just a mirror image of the Xiang Army. The only real difference was that Li Hongzhang took orders from Zheng Guofan, whom was supposedly taking orders from Beijing, but increasingly was becoming more and more independent. Empress Dowager Cixi and Prince Gong basically had no choice in the matter. They had to allow Zheng Guofan his autonomy, because he was proving to be one of the very few commanders capable of dealing defeats to the Taiping. In November, they issued edicts appointing Zheng Guofan as the Governor-General and Imperial Commissioner of Anhui, Jiangsu, and Jiangxi, alongside military control over Zhejiang provinces. This was some pretty crazy stuff. He basically controlled 4 of the richest and most densely populated provinces in all China. Zheng Guofan received the news of his new appointments at the same time as the news of what was occurring during the coup, and he was pretty surprised to say the least. Control over Zhejiang was a miserable part of the news, of course, as it was literally being attacked with Hangzhou and Ningbo falling at that time, and he was a bit overwhelmed by everything, and he wrote in his diary this: "This power is too great. My stature will be too high, and my undeserved reputation has outgrown itself. This terrifies me to the extreme." Despite his anxiety over it all, Zheng Guofan set to work and basically ordered his subordinates to perform a complete takeover of the civil administration of eastern China. Zheng Guofan's top subordinates became the individual governors of each province under them, with Li Hongzhang receiving Jiangsu, Zhou Zongtang Zhejiang, and 2 other protégés took Jiangxi and Anhui. Now Zheng Guofan was able to redirect tax revenue from said provinces under his control, meaning he could hire and supply more troops for what he was about to do. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just now finishing up a multi-part series on China's warlord era. And just a friendly reminder, I now have my own Patreon. You can find it at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where I have exclusive content based off of what you want to hear more about that I can't cover in these podcast series. So please check it out. The first episode is a look at the fentanyl crisis of North America going on today and how it compares to the opium wars of the 19th century. I assure you, it's an interesting podcast. Emperor Sam Fong was dead, and Empress Dowager Cixi was in charge. Zheng Guofan was making a ton of progress, but there was simply not enough men, so he had his student, Li Hongzhang, form the new Anhui Army. China would never be the same.